Barbara Burstin is a respected Holocaust and Jewish studies scholar. She's written 3 books on the history of the Pittsburgh Jewish community. She wrote and produced a documentary film, A Jewish Legacy Pittsburgh, in 2001. In 2019, she was the history consultant and producer of a film by Ken Love entitled Jewish Memories of the Hill. In 2019, she also published a biography of Sophie Masloff, which you can find at sophiemasloff.com, the first female and first Jewish mayor of the city of Pittsburgh, who presided from 1988 to 1994. In addition to teaching undergraduate at Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh, she has been a popular speaker in the community and has offered a number of classes in the CMU and Pitt Osher program. She earned a bachelor's degree in economics from Vassar College, a master's in history education from Columbia University, and a doctorate in history from the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Burstin is joining me today for a conversation about her course on America and the Holocaust, and I am so honored to be recording this conversation with you today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you teach this class that is about the United States during the Holocaust, which I think we could talk about for weeks and weeks. So in order to do this in an amount of time that we can control, I'm going to start with a question. You start your class talking about FDR and Hitler. So why is that? Why do you start there?
You know, it's such a perfect time to start because it's like almost a theatrical setup, because both men, these iconic figures in very different ways, come to power within 5 weeks of each other. Hitler assumes power January 30th, and Roosevelt is sworn in March 4th, 1933. And so you have this entering the stage from different directions, these charismatic leaders. I mean, they both were charismatic leaders who had enormous followings. But look at the difference between these two men. Look at the values. And for teachers in particular to look at this issue of leadership and what kind of a leader they were back in the 30s and have students think about what kind of leadership we want today, I think is such a crucial gift that you're giving students, to have them really think about the values and the style that they want a leader to exhibit. And when you think about it, I mean, Hitler, of course, was leading his nation into war. Roosevelt, of course, wanted peace. Roosevelt asked his people to please follow him. He asked them to follow him. And Hitler, of course, said, follow me or else. You'll wind up in jail or worse. There's such different styles, such different values. We need to really contrast this and offer students this dynamic.
One thing that you do that I think makes your work so interesting is you bring it to the local level a lot of the time. So let's talk about that throughout this conversation, because I mean, one thing that is striking to me is when you bring the United States into this conversation, it collapses that distance. You know, it's easy for students to think learning about the Holocaust, they're learning about something that happened a really long time ago and really far away and doesn't have anything to do with us in the United States, let alone us in Pittsburgh and in the Pittsburgh area. So a lot of things were happening in Germany during 1933 and after, with the rise of the Nazis. And one of the things that happened very early on was the book burning. And so can you talk to me a little bit about that and how you teach about it in your class?
Well, there were a number of things in 1933 that certainly somebody could pick up on. You mentioned the book burning. In Germany, at the universities, and this is something to reflect on too, universities in Germany were bastions of intolerance, of anti-Semitism, racism, hatred. It's such a contrast to how we feel about our, not just colleges, but our high schools, the values that teachers are committed to impart to their students. So you have in Germany in 1933 a book burning of books by Jewish authors, including Einstein, including some of the most famous writers and anybody. I mean, they had books burning by some Americans as well who were peace advocates and so forth. So Helen Keller, who was a advocate for the blind. So this was a demonstration of total intolerance and the notion that only Germans are the quote unquote the master race and so forth. In Pittsburgh in particular, we had a demonstration that made national news, which I think was fascinating, and it was led by the head of the Carnegie Institute at that time, Samuel Hardin Church, who was not Jewish, but who got together the presidents of the leading universities, Pitt, Duquesne, CMU, of course it wasn't called CMU at that time, the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, got together these leaders to organize a mass protest that was held at Carnegie Hall, I believe, to protest against the book burning. And in that, they had this pageant where 100 Jewish students deposited books and gave them to the head of the library here in Pittsburgh in this demonstration of just a counter protest to what was happening in Germany. So that's fascinating to read about. That took place in Pittsburgh.
And this is a time, I feel like there are a lot of misconceptions about what the world knew about what was going on in Germany.
Well, that's true, but there was enough. There was enough. I also want to mention a couple of other things, because I think in 1933, it's a great time to really press students to think about their response. And one of the things that I do is in 1933, there was a dismissal of all quote unquote non-Aryans, which included Jews, from any civil service positions, from postal workers to university professors, without regard to their quality, to their seniority, to anything about their work ability, simply because they were Jewish. There was also a boycott of Jewish businesses. So I asked students, well, how should the government respond to this? How should America respond to these blatant acts of discrimination against citizens of Germany, who many of whom had lived there for generations, who had fought in World War I, who considered themselves German patriots? What should the United States do in response? And it's very interesting because students sometimes think, well, maybe we should protest and so forth. And the reality is that we did not. We did not do anything. We did not withdraw an ambassador. We did not write any kind of protest or launch any kind of counter boycott. But it's fascinating to look at the reasons. And I always stress the context, because this is not a bashing of the United States, but it is an effort to understand what was going on here, the problems Roosevelt had to deal with after Franklin Roosevelt, of course, is our president, what he was up against. And one of the reasons that his advisors urged him not to do anything is because the United States would be attacked as being totally hypocritical. Because how can we protest what Hitler is doing to his Jewish citizens, when look what we are doing to our Black citizens? And so we get into a little bit of the plight, the discrimination, the segregation, the lynching of Blacks in America, particularly in the South, and what's going on. So this is an opportunity to introduce that subject into conversation. And of course, this is just the beginning of introducing the subject of anti-Semitism in the United States, which was at record levels, which maybe you want to ask me more about.
Yes.
But that comes in, that's going to unfold as we go along.
There are a couple of direct connections I see with what was happening in the United States with race, with the Jim Crow South, and what was happening in Germany with the Nuremberg race laws. Is that something that you get into with your students?
Absolutely, because, and this is coming out now, there's been a number of books and stories pointing out how the laws that are going to be passed, the Nuremberg laws in particular, which are going to deny, this is now 1935, are going to deny Jews citizenship, no matter what even if, as I say, they fought and died in World War I. And they're going to be segregated. They're not going to be able to intermarry with quote unquote Aryans, German Christians. The legislation that is now going to be, and it's interesting because these are laws that are going to be passed by the German government, but of course they're totally immoral laws. And so just because it's a law doesn't mean that it's a just law, but that's another story. But a lot of the understanding the format, they took right from American Jim Crow laws, American segregation laws that were rife in this country in the South. So we provided the template for what the Germans were doing, which is a shocking kind of recognition that this indeed was the case, and the Germans acknowledged it. And in fact, in some instances, they thought that our race laws were harsher than what they were willing to impose in Germany. Unbelievable kinds of, this whole relationship between what we were doing in the United States and what Germany was going to begin to impose under Hitler and the Nazis.
Is this shocking to students?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. This is something, that's why this course is, I tell students, this course comes with a warning label because it brings the whole topic of the Holocaust into American life, into their turf, into their home space, okay? Because when you begin, and this is the first class that I deal with, I send students into discussion groups. What is the connection? My course is entitled U.S. and the Holocaust. Well, what is the connection? What's the U.S. have to do with the Holocaust? The Holocaust occurred in Europe. That's what students, if they're going to study anything about the Holocaust, they study it only from the European perspective. Now suddenly I'm introducing the U.S., and it's confusing. They're taking the course, but they really have no idea what they're getting into because they've never had any understanding, any teaching about what's going on in this country, the levels of anti-Semitism, the notion regarding Jews, the discrimination. And this is shocking, and it's shocking particularly because, these students are simply not able to grasp the fact that America has anything to do with what's going on overseas.
So we'll come back to more about what was happening in this country with race. And actually, we can stick with it a little bit because we're in 1935 now and the Nuremberg laws. We're very close now to the 1936 Olympics.
Yes.
So this is really an important moment in talking about race in our country and international response to the Nazis. Well,
it's this is now a major issue, okay? The determination that Berlin would be the site of the Olympic Games in 1936 was determined well before Hitler came to power. So it's not something that he came up with. But now the fact is that the games are scheduled for Berlin in 1936. These laws have been passed in 1935, plus what has been happening since 1933. The news is clearly out there that there is discrimination, including discrimination against Jewish athletes who want to train, who are thrown out of training facilities, who are not able to participate. And there were several world renowned athletes who are now being targeted, not able to participate. So the question is, should the United States go to the Olympic Games? Recognizing that if we do go, we will be giving Hitler a tremendous economic boost because of the athletes going, the tourists going, and so forth. But we're also giving him a tremendous publicity and embracing him, or seeming to embrace him as a world leader, somebody who is respectable, somebody who should be acknowledged by the international community. And it will be a tremendous propaganda bonanza for Hitler. So, plus that, other countries are going to follow our lead. Whatever the United States is going to do, they are going to follow. So this is now a major decision. This is not just a decision that sporting authorities are looking to be involved with, but the citizenry and so forth, and leadership. So it just so happens that in Pittsburgh, again, Ziggy Khan, he was known as Ziggy, I think his first name was Joseph, but he apparently was an athlete, and he zigged across when he played football, so he was known as Ziggy. I guess to avoid being tackled, he wasn't that big a guy. But anyway, he was the sports director of what was known as the Irene Kaufman settlement, which was a settlement established on the Hill that had been established by Jewish women, the National Council of Jewish Women, actually before the turn of the century, but had really catered to the Jewish community, but had also been the first settlement house to invite Blacks to participate. Blacks could still not become members. That was too big of a leap in those days, but they could participate, which was a big deal. Anyway, Ziggy Khan now has to looks at the situation and says, "This is terrible. We should not be going to Berlin." And he begins to organize a boycott movement, and it gains speed and it gains support, and it's going to be ultimately derailed. It's going to fail by a very close vote among the athletes, but it's going to be derailed by one of the bad guys in this, a man by the name of Avery Brundage, who himself was a leader in the International Olympic movement, but he was pro-Nazi. And in fact, it came out later that he had made a deal that if he was able to deliver the American team to the 1936 Olympics, the German government would use his construction company to build consulate offices and so forth in the United States. So it was corrupt. It was totally corrupt. The whole thing was, and he said to the athletes, he said, look, when the athletes this movement started to build, he said, look, I'll go over to Germany and I'll investigate what's happening there and I'll come back and report to you. So he goes over and he interviews some of the German athletes who tell him that, oh, everything's fine, okay? And he comes back and reports back to the Athletic Association, everything's fine. But what he neglects to say is that he interviewed the German athletes in the presence of the Gestapo. So their lives were on the line, okay? That's a little detail that he neglects to say. And he comes back and basically he's able to prevail and the athletes vote against the boycott. And, but what's interesting is I have students role play. I have them pretend that they are perhaps Jewish athletes, American Jewish athletes, or American Black athletes. How do they feel about going? And what's interesting is that, of course, the Black athletes, many Black athletes say, look, we need to go to show him that we're not inferior, that we're respected and so forth. And then you have the counter argument that how can you go and support this regime and so forth. And the athletes themselves, recognizing that they have trained for years for this moment, the athletes themselves, many of them decide they're not going to vote for, they're not going to go. And this is what happened at the time. Now, more voted to go than not to go. But the fact that they were willing to make that sacrifice and boycott something that they had been training for was admirable. But you have the other side of the story too, that, as I said, Black athletes felt they wanted to show Hitler what they were capable of doing. Jewish athletes. There's an interesting footnote that there were 2 Jewish athletes who were part of an American relay team that had trained. They were destined, they were world champions. They had proved it already in other competitions. The day of the race, or maybe the day before the race, the American captain pulled the 2 Jews off the relay team and substituted 2 others, and the team won. But those 2 Jewish athletes who were pulled off the American team were furious. They were furious at the American captain for doing this, and he did it, quote unquote, not to embarrass Hitler by having 2 Jews win Olympic gold. So what kind of a message was that? What kind of a response was that? So students look at that. We talk about, people's behavior in light of these difficult times. Okay, what's interesting, and I could go on and on about the Olympics, what's interesting is that in 1980, Jimmy Carter, who was not one of our most renowned presidents, at least historians looking back over his career, but in 1980, Jimmy Carter said America should not go to the Olympic Games, which were scheduled in Moscow, because Moscow had just invaded Afghanistan, which is interesting history because Afghanistan today is still, in those days, we supported the Taliban against the Russians who had just invaded. Now, of course, the Taliban are not our friends, but that was 40 years ago. And we did not go to the Olympic Games, and Jimmy Carter was absolutely pilloried for that decision. Another footnote, Avery Brundage wanted to atone for what had happened in 1936. After all, Hitler, what subsequently happened after we went. And the games were scheduled for Munich, Germany in 1972. Have your students look up what happened in Munich, Germany in 1972, where the Germans basically provided no security and 11 Israeli athletes were murdered in Munich. I don't know where you go from here. It's right. Interesting. I noted something that just hit me recently, not recently. 11 Israeli athletes were murdered in 1972, and 11 Jews were murdered in the Tree of Life massacre in 2018.
Right. That's a chilling symmetry. And I do want us to come back to talking about anti-Semitism in the United States then, now. But before we conclude our conversation about the Olympics, I want to talk just for a little bit of time, because one of the most important stories that came out of those Olympics that continue to inspire people is the story of Jesse Owens.
Well, I can do better than Jesse Owens if you want to talk about closer to home. It's
Sure.
True. Jesse Owens was a Black athlete who literally ran away with gold. But we had somebody from Connellsville who was a freshman at Pitt, John Woodruff, and he won a gold medal in the Olympic Games from Connellsville, Pennsylvania. Comes back to Pitt and cannot play on the football team because he's Black. Was bitter against Pitt, because what happened subsequently is that there was a relay, a competition in the South with various teams, track stars, and Woodruff was participating, but he was not allowed. As a black man, he could not stay with the team because blacks were segregated, okay? New York University refused to go under those circumstances where their black teammates could not reside with the white teammates. Pitt went. We caved into that, okay? And Woodruff never forgave Pitt, but I forget how many years ago, maybe about 10 years ago, at a Pitt football game, Mark Nordenberg, the chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh, invited John Woodruff, who by that time was elderly, was in a wheelchair, onto the field and publicly apologized to him on behalf of the university, but many years later. So, interesting.
That's very powerful. Wow. So we're now
this whole issue of the response of American universities to what's going on in Europe. We can't be so proud of that. There was not these massive protests, and students sometimes who did protest were frowned upon by the university administration. That's a good research paper. I've asked students in the past to do some research. I know that CMU took several Jewish refugee scholars, but the American universities were not opening their doors to these Jews who had lost their jobs, who were desperate to get out of Europe, whose lives were on the line. Harvard University had an exchange with Heidelberg, which was a hotbed of anti-Semitism. We cannot look to our universities in the 1930s as so great. There was anti-Semitism among the leadership and sometimes among the students, but we're talking about the leadership, which of course now raises the issue, maybe I'll help you jump into that, of refugees.
Yes.
Anti-Semitism in the United States, because the United States, really, the universities reflected what's going on here. I think students, and this is what's really shocking to students, the level of anti-Semitism in the United States was something that they simply had never learned about. And when you look at public opinion polls that were taken at that time, Jews were seen as a menace to society. At least, 20% and more of Americans thought Jews were some sort of a menace. Why? They were struggling in the Depression just like everybody else. They were not armed. Nobody had any guns. I mean, why are they a menace? Well, they're a menace because the propaganda from Germany is only heightening the earlier notions about Jews. And so they are seen as conspirators. They are seen somewhat as suspicious, as a menace. What's fascinating, the number of anti-Semitic groups that have formed by the 1930s are over 100. They exist in every city, including in Pittsburgh. You had the German American Bund here on the north side in Pittsburgh. And what is so disturbing is that the propaganda that's being spewed out by Joseph Goebbels in Nazi Germany is being shipped to the United States and being distributed by the German American Bund here in Pittsburgh and throughout the country. So you're getting Nazi propaganda coming here in the 1930s that's only heightening the sentiments against Jews. It's extraordinary. I use these public opinion polls to really prove to students I asked them, why are Jews seen as a menace? Why is there reluctance to respond to Jewish refugees? And the question is, the point is the propaganda is working, okay, which raises the issue of lies, of untruths, how they infect the people, how you counter that. And in the 1930s, we didn't do a very good job of that. But the issue of what news people are getting today is so, I mean, these conspiracy theories are scary and they're being spread. How do we, especially on social media, how do we separate the reality from these terrible myths and accusations?
Well, you mentioned the shooting at the Tree of Life in 2018, and to me, as a Holocaust educator, it really shifted my focus in teaching, because previously I worried that students would learn about the Holocaust in a limited amount of time and wouldn't know things like the richness of Jewish life in Europe, which, you know, we risk losing sight of that when we teach about the Holocaust. But then I realized after the shooting that students don't realize this long history of anti-Semitism, how anti-Semitic our country was, and how some groups continue to subscribe to those beliefs and would do violence in the name of those beliefs. So it's a very important subject to my thinking.
I couldn't agree with you more.
So,
and of course, looking at the roots of anti-Semitism, why the Jews? You know, Hitler didn't just invent this,
right?
Okay, and this is very difficult for teachers to convey, to understand, but it's something that Holocaust scholars have really noted, that the history, and I make the statement in class, which is very difficult for many students. The Holocaust began with the Christian Gospels, okay, and that's a shocking statement, especially for students, for Christians who are devout Christians who have never. This strikes them as a blasphemy, as something that is a terrible thing to say, because they have never studied the history of anti-Semitism. But if you were to look at the Christian Gospels with a non-faith view, just as an academic, as a historian trying to understand the history, not only does the Christian Gospels talk about how God has rejected the Jews because they have not accepted Jesus Christ, but Jews are blamed for the death of Christ. And over the centuries, Jews have been attacked, accused, burned at the stake for the notion that Jews are responsible for killing their Lord. After all, what could be more horrible than the notion that somebody has killed your Lord? It must mean that you're the devil, that you are satanic. And of course, if you look at Matthew, may the blood be on us and on our children. Okay, so over the centuries, especially in backward lands, in lands that have not been in any way enlightened, Jews, for many people, deserve whatever they get for the original sin of killing Christ. And so allegedly killing Christ. Historians now will say that was not the case. It was part of the Christianity trying to promote a new religion, so they blame the Jews. But if you believe that the Jews killed Christ, which has happened over the centuries, then whatever happens to them, they deserve. And if you participate in it, you're doing God's work in killing Jews. For modern Christians, for those young people in our classrooms now, this is shocking because in the aftermath of the Holocaust, Christian teaching has changed dramatically. Okay, and we must acknowledge that Christianity, both Catholic teaching and Protestant teaching, now does not talk about Jews as the devil having murdered Christ and so forth. If there's any notion that Jews killed Christ, it's enveloped in the notion that Christ had to die to save man's sins. This is heavy stuff. This is really heavy stuff, emotional stuff, difficult stuff. But it is a response to the question, well, why did he pick on Jews? Why is there so much anti-Semitism? Okay? And, it all started with this, and it has evolved. We don't have to go into the whole evolution of anti-Semitism, but it makes it easy to blame Jews because Jews are already seen by most Christians, certainly in the past, as suspicious characters. After all, why didn't they accept our Lord? Something must be the matter with them. Okay, so you take it from there. And this is very difficult.
It is very difficult and also very detailed. I mean, there's a lot to it to understand the history of anti-Semitism and its evolution and why it persists today in a similar but slightly different form, constantly evolving. I mean, it's it's been a very fluid idea that always comes down to suspicion of Jews and often intent to hurt and kill Jews. So, I mean, we live with that. We live with that still. And this is very much part of the calculation in the 30s when you have hundreds of thousands of Jews in Germany trying to find safe harbor.
Right.
And it's interesting. Another thing to think about is the Jews in Germany who felt so German that they didn't want to leave, but many did. So if we can talk a little bit about what that entailed and what the response was in the United States.
Okay. It's true. A lot of German Jews were reluctant to leave because they couldn't believe that in this modern country of Germany, and Germany was the most progressive country in Europe at the time. So many Germans thought that Hitler was would only be a fleeting kind of situation, that he was an anomaly, that the German people would never support him. And of course, they were obviously wrong. But when they did decide that they needed to get out, and of course, now we're talking by 1938, the next big attack on Jews, Kristallnacht, which there's been a lot written about it. I might say that Roosevelt at this time did withdraw the American ambassador from Germany as a protest. We were the only democratic country to do that. So on this occasion, America is leading, but where can they go? And the problem is that we had on our books, and this is another aspect that is so contemporary, because what is our attitude towards immigrants? What is our attitude towards refugees? And there is a difference, okay? In 1924, the American Congress, which was littered with anti-Semites and anti-Catholic individuals as well. In 1924, and this is something else, a Pittsburgh connection, which is not so admirable, a bill known as the Johnson-Reed Act was passed. It was first 1921 and then enforced in 1924, which basically did two things. It limited the total number of immigrants into the United States to about 150,000. We had been having 800,000, 900,000, 1 million coming a year. Now we're cutting down. And the second aspect is that we're going to specify from where these people can come from. In other words, who we want and who we don't want, okay? And if you can look at this closely, you will see that half of that number is supposed to come from Great Britain, because white Anglo-Saxon Protestants clearly were, shall we say, appreciated more, okay? Which means that only 75,000 can come from the rest of the world. Asians are excluded, Africans are excluded, forget that, okay? But it means that from Italy, only several thousand, from Poland, from parts of Russia, only several thousand, throughout Eastern Europe. Germany, as a little more quote unquote white Anglo-Saxon country, has going to be, Germany and Austria combined, is going to be about 27,000. So that's, considering, that's pretty high percentage of that 75,000 that are left, okay? So how did this act come about? This is well before Hitler. It's 1924, okay? So why are we doing this? Well, you have to look at the backlash to the immigrants who were coming over at the turn of the 20th century, primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe, primarily who are Catholics, primarily who are Orthodox, with, and I'm talking about Greek and Russian Orthodox, and then several million Jews, okay, who are a tiny minority of those coming over, okay? And the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who dominated, who were in our Congress, decides they don't want these people because they don't look like me, they don't talk like me, they don't think like me, they're not going to be able to assimilate into American life, they're bad, and so we're going to keep them out, okay? So there are quotas. The quotas are low from the areas precisely where Hitler is going to overrun. They're not going to be able to get here. That Immigration Act is going to stay on the books all through the 1930s and 40s, okay? The Pittsburgh connection is that the Johnson-Reed Act, David Reed was the senator from Pennsylvania who was a Pittsburgher. He was a prominent lawyer here in Pittsburgh, and he believed that these immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, who were, as I say, Catholic, not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants or not Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They were white, but they weren't, simply were not good fodder for America. And so he was a sponsor of this legislation, which is going to be on the books, which Roosevelt is going to have to deal with, which Roosevelt was told that if he even attempts to liberalize that act, that if anything, Congress will close the door more and will not open it to more refugees. So you have in 1939, you have the St. Louis, which is a ship filled with 900 German immigrants who are desperate, who have done everything they could to get on this ship and to get out of Germany. They are supposed to go to Cuba. Cuba will not accept them. They are off the Miami, in the Miami harbor, and we will not let these people disembark because of the quotas, because they can't get into the United States, and Roosevelt's in a bind. He will be absolutely pilloried if he lets them in. He's advised, even though the humanitarian instinct is there, he's advised not to let them in because Roosevelt has to think about preparing this country for a war. It's 1939. He believes in his heart that war is coming, which of course it is, that America has to prepare to defend against Hitler, who's been on the loose in aggression. And he needs Congress legislation to support our army, which is ranked, I think, 17th in the world at that point. It's no draft, there's no supplies, we're totally unprepared. People are using broomsticks for guns and training. I mean, there's nothing. And he needs legislation to prepare America for war. He can't risk losing his popularity and his political capital in Congress and among the American people. He can't risk losing it to let in 900 refugees when he's got to prepare for a war. Nothing's easy. Nothing is black and white.
Looking back on that, a lot of people are highly critical of Roosevelt's response. What do you think?
I would, and I've been in a situation where I've defended Roosevelt and been attacked. I remember it so distinctly. I won't describe it, but I'm attacked verbally. And I think that in the 1930s, there's a lot of context that you have to recognize. The competing pressure he is under, which is too much to go into now. I do feel that once the war has started, if we can jump now to the actual war, and the question, once the war starts, of course, the Holocaust starts by really 1941. More than 1 million people are dead. People have died in 1940 through the ghettos, this process of destruction that I described. 1941, 1942 is called the killing year. Over 2.3 million, whatever million people are killed in 1942 alone. But the question is, what do we know? What do we really know about what's happening? Because it's war. There's not this communication. We don't have correspondence on the ground. What do we know? And so this becomes a major issue, which we could discuss. But the bottom line is that by November of 1942, the American State Department has confirmed, yes, there is a plan afoot to murder all the Jews that come under Hitler's control. Okay, they have confirmed it. Okay, which means we can no longer say, well, we don't believe it, we don't know, how can we do anything? So now the question is, what do we do about that? What can we do about that in 1943? So again, I'm not getting into details. We're still in the middle of this war. We're still not, we haven't even really invaded. The D-Day is still a year away. We're not being very successful. We've started to attack in Italy. We're not being very successful. The Germans are really, and the Italians are really decimating our forces. What do we do? Okay, and yet there are things we could have done that we're not doing. And I do feel that Roosevelt is not focused on how to save Jews. Having said that, he's focused on winning a war. So his own wife, Eleanor, is critical of Roosevelt and says, you know, this was his biggest failing. And I think that's probably true. But thank God for Roosevelt, because he was a man who confronted Hitler, who prepared us for the war, who got us through this war, who was really a commander-in-chief in terms of deciding what we should be doing to confront the Germans and when. There are a lot of books written about how Churchill, even though he was great in 1940 when England stood alone against Hitler. Churchill's military strategy would have been a disaster, and Roosevelt is countering that. You know, so 1943 could have been better. By the end of 1943, though, the officials, non-Jews in America's State Treasury Department have come to Roosevelt and said, look, you should know what's happening. The State Department is suppressing information. That's another whole story, a big story. The State Department is intent on not doing anything, not spreading the news, because then it would be more pressure for them to do something. But the Treasury Department officials finally go to Roosevelt. Roosevelt acts. He sets up what's known as the War Refugee Board in January of 1944, and the War Refugee Board really springs into action and saves tens of thousands of people through various means. Again, I won't go into that, but Raoul Wallenberg, who is a Swedish man who was tapped to go to Hungary, which is the last bastion of Jewish survivors, and try and save Jews, which he does. And, you know, or attempts to anyway. So the War Refugee Board is finally the United States' first humanitarian effort to really save Jews. But it doesn't come till 1944. Most of the Jews are dead. Okay? Anyway.
So when we've talked about this, we've talked about moral dilemmas, and a way to engage students around this conversation is to see that this is all in a gray area. I mean, when we believe one thing would have been the right thing to do, we have to balance it against what would not have happened.
Right.
So it's very complicated, and it's hard to look at history with counterfactuals. We can learn from that, but it's hard. We have
but this era raises such questions today on what kind of political leadership we want. How are we going to combat false narratives and lies? Okay. How do we feel about immigration? In those days, there was no separation between an immigrant and a refugee, somebody who was fleeing for their lives. Okay. How do we respond? In the 1930s, we really did not respond to refugees. Okay, it was not part of our DNA. We didn't see ourselves as a moral leader. Do we see ourselves now as a moral leader? Is it our responsibility to do something for immigrants and refugees, recognizing that we cannot take in the world? I mean, a lot of people want to come here. We can't have everybody come, but how do we balance a response to refugees that is fair and just and evidences our concern with the fact that we can't let everybody in? Are we doing that today? Clearly, there are a lot who will say we are not. Yeah. So these are some of the issues that are so, and of course, anti-Semitism, racism, prejudice, hate. 1930s gave us an example, perhaps, of what not to do, or at least raising the issues. We see how they responded in the 1930s and 40s. How do we feel about that? And whatever we feel about it then, we can talk about it now. And it really, for students, for young people, it raises these issues and brings them into contemporary focus so that history is not just in the past, it's very real. And I, of course, had this because 3 days after the Tree of Life massacre, I had to go into my Holocaust class and face the students who were stunned, who were traumatized, recognizing that what they had learned about was not the past, it was prelude to the present. And that was shocking.
So we experienced the same thing at the Holocaust Center, of course, because we're open to the public, and suddenly everyone who's coming to the Holocaust Center is in shock and traumatized. And understanding that when we're teaching about the Holocaust, we are in many ways teaching about the present. So I'm also looking at the time. There are a couple of things that I think we could really get into. We may have a follow-up conversation, but one thing that we talked about was what was happening here when the war ended. And we got into this a little bit with the story of the athlete from Pitt, John Woodruff, who wasn't allowed to play football at Pitt after the Olympics. But what was the situation here, especially with the Black community and with the men who had fought in the war coming back to Pittsburgh?
When you think about the liberators, okay, young guys who, are your age, for the students, and suddenly they come they're fighting a battle, and suddenly they come across a concentration camp where there are bodies laying all around. The stench is enormous. These skeletons are greeting them with open arms if they're able to move. They're emaciated. how is that impacting on a young person who has never seen this and it was never warned that this might happen, okay? Because these guys are stumbling on this, and it's like another world. It's a planet that they've suddenly been transported to that is the most horrible thing they've ever seen. They come back, Black liberators especially. Here they have fought a war against racism and the Jews who have fought a war against, and we have, several Pittsburgh survivors. Fritz Ottenheimer, who escaped out of Germany as a young man and was drafted into the American army and now winds up back in Germany and sees this. How did these people come back now to America and see racism and anti-Semitism here? They begin to speak up, okay? And you have that. I can't tell you about Pittsburgh, but I know one GI from Philadelphia who made it his life's mission to not only speak about what he saw, but to tie it to the effort to really do something in America. We cannot have defeated racism and anti-Semitism in Germany, at least Hitler's army. I mean, we can't talk about the attitudes of the Germans themselves. That's another problem. But defeated Hitler's army and come back to America and have all this discrimination, hatred, prejudice against Blacks and Jews here in this country. So you do have an effort, and I know that within the Jewish community, there were a number of people who really became involved with, for instance, dealing with intercultural studies in high schools, trying to develop curriculum that would promote more understanding of different groups. You had involvement with the creation of the Human Relations Commission here in Pittsburgh. It was a statewide effort. We have it in Pittsburgh developed. So these are concrete efforts now to try to attack some of the problems. And of course, Harry Truman, who takes over from Roosevelt. Roosevelt dies before the war ends. He dies April 12, 1945. Harry Truman, as a Southerner, interestingly enough, from Missouri, he really now begins to attack discrimination, outlawing any kind of segregation in the army and so forth. So we have some national leadership that begins, and we begin on the local level as well. So this was one of the themes that the civil rights movement, in a sense, it's true we talk about the 60s, but we have to go back and look at the impact of the Holocaust and these GIs coming back home and the administration, what was done even in the late 40s to begin attacking some of the ills of our own society.
And that work continues in 2020.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It needs to big time. But we all can be involved in that effort.
So I want us to conclude for now. If you would reflect on the value of learning about the Holocaust at this point in time. Why are we still teaching about this?
I think the Holocaust is perhaps the most compelling example of where prejudice can lead, where words, lies, accusations, they are not just innocent, they are potential triggers for action. And certainly we see this in the Holocaust, where every man, woman, and baby, child was killed, okay? Innocent civilians. So I think the Holocaust is certainly not the only example, unfortunately. There have been tremendous examples, terrible examples of genocide, okay? But the Holocaust demonstrates where public opinion can go if it's so infected, and where the Holocaust is not just this spontaneous outbreak of murder. It's a planned attack by a quote unquote liberal state, by a state administration. And it shows also, one of the things also that I talk about is these are smart people. The people who implemented the Holocaust. After all, how do you get the trains to run on time? How do you kill so many people at one time? You need scientists to create the gas chambers, to use the gas. You need the bureaucrats to plan the whole process, okay? How did that happen, okay? When a civilized modern society uses the science, the education that they have prided themselves on, when that education is used to murder people, and the population goes along with it because they have been infected with the propaganda, with the lies. What is the story there? What is the message there that we need to know, especially in these times as we go to vote, as we think about what's happening in America today? There are these imperatives that we need to really address. And the Holocaust, in its multi-dimension, raises these issues about the society we are having, the leadership we are having, and what place we want to have in the world. It's heavy stuff.
Well,
Stuff.
This is heavy and very important stuff. And thank you for all that you do to inspire students to do this very difficult work. And what you've done for me personally and for the Holocaust Center as we take the role that we are taking as educators and as an organization that is poised to do the hard work locally, regionally, and beyond. Because we do think that this history teaches us very important things about our responsibility today.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you've opened this topic up, because I think that looking at America and the Holocaust, it brings it home in a way that can be even more effective. And I really hope that teachers will consider implementing some of this. I'd be happy to, be involved in that or something. I don't know if you want to talk about what we're planning.
Well, I think that's for another time, and then
Okay.
I'll be very excited to talk about what we're planning. We can leave that as a cliffhanger for future viewers.
Tune in tomorrow for the next installment.
It's really such a joy to work with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And to be continued.
Bye.